You ever watched an old late-night interview and thought, wait, is this guy actually high on TV right now? Because for 3 decades, millions of Americans went to bed with the same comforting ritual. Blue curtain opens, smooth theme music, the host strolls out, delivers a perfect monologue, then settles behind the desk like a pilot in full control of the cockpit. It all looked so polished, so safe, so predictable. But backstage? Backstage was chaos. There were nights when the most powerful show in television was being held together by a man in a suit, calmly interviewing guests who were, in reality, absolutely blasted. Now, let's pull that curtain back. There were code words, secret signals, panicked producers, and some of the biggest names in comedy, film, and music stepping out in front of America while high as a kite. And somehow, the guy behind the desk made it look like everything was totally fine. Tonight, we're walking through 7 of the wildest times that happened, and how one late-night legend kept the train on the tracks. Before we meet the guests, you need to picture the setup. The cameras, the band, the studio audience, the timing. All of it was a well-rehearsed ballet. The host wasn't just a comedian, he was the ringmaster of the whole circus. And he had one advantage nobody at home did. He could usually tell, within seconds, what kind of shape his guest was in. If someone walked out a little too loose, a little too happy, there were subtle signs only the crew understood. A tug on the tie during the introduction might mean, "This one's not exactly sober, be ready." Straightening the stack of cards twice? That was code for the director. Keep the shots simple, stay wide. Anything could happen. No one in the audience had a clue. But backstage, production assistants were quietly bracing for impact. The pressure cooker behind those curtains was real. A great appearance could launch a career. A bad one could haunt you for years. There were no pre-approved scripts, no carefully edited segments. The host wanted real, messy, unpredictable conversation. So what did nervous celebrities do before walking out in front of millions of people, live or close to it? They drank, they smoked, they snorted, they popped pills. And the green room was the perfect place to do it. The bar back there was legendary. Top-shelf liquor, always stocked. And the unspoken rule was simple. 1 drink was fine, 2 was risky, 3 was, we'll deal with this when they're already on the couch. Added to that was the vibe of the era. This was the age of discos, all-night clubs, and mountains of cocaine. Rock stars, actors, even Wall Street guys were running on chemical fuel. Late-night TV didn't float above that culture, it was soaked in it. But the man in the suit behind the desk? He had a very specific way of dealing with altered states. If a guest showed up a little relaxed, he'd gently guide them through. If they were really gone, he'd simplify the questions, shorten the segment, and make it look like a bit instead of a crisis. Sometimes, he was essentially babysitting a grown, famous adult in front of the entire country, without ever letting the audience see him sweat. And that brings us to guest number 1, George Carlin, the beautifully functioning stoner. If there was ever a guy who made being high look like part of the job description, it was George Carlin. Carlin started his career with short hair, neat suits, and clean jokes. Then, the late 60 seconds and early 70 seconds hit. The hair grew long, the material got sharper, and the weed, well, let's just say the weed became part of the package. When Carlin sat down in that chair, he often had that unmistakable, "I'm relaxed," in a way the censors don't fully approve of, look in his eyes, not sloppy, not messy, just elevated. But here's the key. He was still deadly sharp. He'd riff, he'd glide from topic to topic like his brain was surfing, and his timing was flawless. People behind the cameras could tell he'd lit up before walking out, but the magic was that he was completely functional. If anything, it seemed to unlock a different gear in his comedy. The host understood that. He didn't treat George Carlin like a problem to manage. Instead, he adjusted the way he interviewed him. The questions got broader, more open-ended. What do you think about? How would you describe? Then he'd lean back and let Carlin roam. And roam he did. Carlin later admitted in his own words that yes, he was usually high during those spots in the 70 seconds. And honestly, you can kind of tell. The loose, philosophical, almost musical flow of his thoughts became part of his charm. But because he was prepared, professional, and funny as hell, his state never turned into a full-blown problem. He wasn't staggering or slurring. He was a high-functioning artist using cannabis the way some people use coffee. If Carlin was proof that you could be stoned and still crush it, our next guest showed what happens when genius meets something much more dangerous. Richard Pryor. Brilliant, blazing, and on the edge. If George Carlin was the thoughtful stoner, Richard Pryor was raw nerve and live wire. On a good night, he was the funniest human being on the planet. On a bad night, you could feel the room tilt. Pryor's struggles with drugs, especially cocaine, are no secret, and some of the most intense chapters of that struggle spilled right onto late-night television. There were appearances where he walked out calm, collected, and laser-focused. He'd talk about his childhood, race, relationships, the absurdity of life. The audience would be doubled over. The host would sit there grinning, knowing he was witnessing genius. Then, there were other nights. Those were the nights when Pryor would start in one lane and drift into another mid-sentence. A joke about growing up might suddenly melt into a half-formed observation about the universe, then pivot into something dark and personal. His eyes would glaze for a second, then snap back. You could actually see the moment the host flipped into protect mode. A quick joke to lighten the mood. A clean question to redirect him. A smooth toss to commercial right when things started to drift too far. What looked like casual late-night banter was, in reality, crisis management disguised as comedy. The host wasn't there to humiliate Richard Pryor. He admired him. He understood how fragile that brilliance was. So instead of leaning into the chaos for cheap laughs, he did the opposite. He tried to build a safety net under him. Check in with him off camera. Ask mutual friends how he was doing. Bring him back, but watch more closely. With Pryor, every appearance felt like walking a tightrope. One side, iconic television, the other, a complete unraveling. And the man sitting behind the desk had to somehow keep him on the wire without letting the audience see how dangerous the fall could be. But as wild as Pryor's visits could get, he was still performing, still funny, still there. Our next guest wasn't. Truman Capote. When just a little something goes way too far, you don't necessarily expect a soft-spoken literary icon to deliver one of the most uncomfortable, substance-fueled train wrecks in late-night history. But that's exactly what happened with Truman Capote. He'd been on the show many times. Usually, he was sharp, witty, and delightfully odd in the best possible way. People loved hearing him talk. He had that mix of gossip, insight, and mischief that made him the perfect late-night storyteller. Then came the infamous appearance. The moment Truman Capote stepped out, people backstage knew something was wrong. His walk wasn't steady. His words came out mushy, like his tongue was 2 seconds behind his brain. His head kept dipping forward, then jerking back up like he was trying not to fall asleep at the dinner table. The control room quietly freaked out. The host tried to rescue the moment. The questions got simpler. The tone softened. He gave Capote every chance to find a coherent lane, but there was nothing to grab onto. This wasn't a relaxed guest. This wasn't a functioning stoner or a brilliant but scattered mind. This was someone so zoned out, likely on a cocktail of pills and alcohol, that he could barely participate. On air, you saw a strained smile and a lot of careful, patient questions. Behind the scenes, boiling anger. The second they cut to commercial, the mask dropped. The host reportedly made it very clear. Truman Capote was done. No more invitations. No more, maybe he'll be better next time. Why the harsh line? Because in his eyes, this wasn't just about a bad night. It was about respect. respect for the audience, for the show, and for the medium. It's one thing to show up a little high and still do your job. It's another to be so far gone you can't even carry a conversation. After that night, backstage rules got tighter. Staff were told to flag any guest who seemed seriously impaired. The green room bar suddenly wasn't quite as free-flowing, and everyone had a very clear example of what too far looked like. But not all chemically enhanced guests were disasters. Some were exactly what you expected. Cheech and Chong, when being stoned, is the entire bit. If anyone ever walked onto that stage and made zero effort to pretend they were sober, it was Cheech Marin and Tommy Chong. They didn't just play stoners. They were stoners. Their whole act revolved around weed, confusion, slow reactions, and the surreal logic of people who are, let's say, comfortably toasted. When Cheech and Chong sat on that couch, nobody in the building was under the illusion that they'd just come from a Bible study. The eyes, the giggles, the way their stories kind of wandered around before eventually landing, it was all part of the package. And here's the fun part. The host leaned into it. He played the straight man, the square, who pretended not to fully get the drug references. He'd ask innocent questions that teed them up perfectly, then sit back and let the chaos unfold. A raised eyebrow at the camera here, a little look of mock confusion there, and the studio audience would lose it. There was no panic in the control room this time, no emergency signals. Because Cheech and Chong being baked wasn't a liability, it was the product. They didn't disrespect the show. They didn't threaten anyone. They weren't falling over. They were high, yes, but they were also professionals who knew how to land a joke, even if their brain was orbiting slightly above the studio. In a way, their appearances showed the host's flexibility. He wasn't there to be a moral policeman. His job was to make entertaining television, and if that meant sitting next to two guys whose brains were marinating in THC and acting as referee while the audience howled, perfect. But if cannabis created a kind of slow, hazy comedy with Cheech and Chong, our next guest took things in a much trippier direction. Peter Fonda, the psychedelic detour. When you think of late 60 seconds counterculture, Peter Fonda is right there near the top of the list. Star of Easy Rider, open about his interest in psychedelics, deeply tied to the whole expand your mind movement. So, when he arrived for a talk show appearance in the early 70 seconds, it wasn't exactly shocking that he looked different. People in the studio remember the eyes first. Wide, shiny, completely locked onto the lights, then drifting to his own hands as if they were suddenly the most fascinating objects in the universe. From the very first question, it was obvious. This man was not fully on planet Earth. The host would ask something simple about a film, a project, an experience. Peter Fonda would start to answer, then veer off into territory that sounded less like a movie promo and more like a late-night dorm room philosophy session. Time, he suggested, wasn't really a straight line. It was a loop, a blanket, a wave. We were all surfing consciousness. Now, that might make for an interesting podcast in 2025, but on network television, with a live audience and advertisers watching the clock, it quickly set off alarms. The host gave the quiet signal. The cards on the desk tapped twice. In the control room, that meant, "We're done here. Go to commercial, now." The segment ended far earlier than planned. When the show returned from the break, Peter Fonda was gone, replaced by the next guest, as if nothing unusual had happened. No lecture, no shaming, just reset. And that was the pattern. No public crucifixion, no grand speech about drugs, just a quiet note for the staff. Give him another chance some other time when he's a little less cosmic. Because to the man in the suit, everyone was allowed an off night. But some off nights were more intense than others. Oliver Reed. When drunk stops being funny. Some people can be charmingly drunk on television. Oliver Reed was not one of them. The British actor had a reputation long before he walked onto that stage. He drank a lot. He boasted about drinking a lot. and he carried himself like a man who thought chaos was part of his brand. The night he appeared on the show, you could apparently smell the alcohol before he even sat down. At first, it was the usual, slurred but understandable answers, big gestures, boisterous energy. The crowd laughed. The host smiled. It seemed manageable. Then it tilted. Oliver Reed got louder. He started interrupting. Instead of following questions, he crashed right over them with off-topic comments and shouted lines. At one point, he stood up and began demonstrating some kind of fighting stance, like he was about to shadowbox in front of America. The vibe shifted from, "Ha, this guy's had a few," to, "Okay, this could get ugly." Security drifted closer without being obvious. The host's body language changed, leaning back a little, eyes sharper, voice firmer. The jokes got shorter. The patience evaporated. This wasn't Cheech Chong being silly. This wasn't George Carlin floating philosophically. This was a guest whose impairment was tipping into aggression. And that was a hard line. The segment was cut short. After the show, the message was simple. Oliver Reed would not be back. Not because he'd had a drink. The host himself enjoyed a cocktail off camera. But because Reed crossed the boundary from entertaining unpredictability to potential threat. 3 rules, quietly enforced. Don't threaten anyone. Don't disrespect the audience. Don't waste airtime. Reed managed to flirt with all 3. And that was that. Sammy Davis Jr., powered up, polished, and rumored. Not every high appearance looked like a disaster. Some were so smooth that the only people who noticed were the ones backstage. Enter Sammy Davis Jr. Singer, dancer, actor, comedian, storyteller. He could do it all. He was one of those guests you booked whenever you wanted, guaranteed gold. He'd sing, he'd crack jokes, he'd drop insane stories about show business, and he'd do it with energy that filled the whole room. But one particular appearance in the mid-70 seconds has lingered in people's memories for a different reason. That night, Sammy Davis Jr. came out like a human pinball. Words flying, legs bouncing, hands moving non-stop. He couldn't sit still. He'd start one story, then interrupt himself to jump into another. His eyes were darting everywhere. The sweat gleamed under the studio lights. To the audience at home, it just looked like Sammy being Sammy, amped, excited, in full entertainer mode. But the people who'd been around the scene long enough recognized the signs. They'd seen that level of energy before, and it usually didn't come from coffee. Rumors swirled that cocaine was part of the engine powering that hyperactive charm. Backstage, no one was really confused about it. But here's what mattered. Even if he was boosted by something stronger than adrenaline, Sammy Davis Jr. stayed professional. He hit his marks. His stories were wild, but coherent. He didn't attack anyone, didn't spiral, didn't collapse. He did exactly what the show needed, just at 1.5x speed. During the break, the host reportedly made a quiet joke to the crew about needing a nap after just sitting next to him. But there was no punishment, no ban, just a knowing shrug, that's show business in the 70 seconds, and on to the next episode. Because, once again, the real issue wasn't what someone might have done in the dressing room. It was, did they deliver on camera? So what does all of this tell us about the guy in the suit who had to handle George Carlin, Richard Pryor, Truman Capote, Cheech Marin, Tommy Chong, Peter Fonda, Oliver Reed, and Sammy Davis Jr. on various levels of out of it? It tells us he was walking a razor-thin line between 2 worlds. On one side, you had the wild, anything-goes culture of show business at its most unfiltered. On the other, you had network television, sponsors, families watching in their pajamas, standards and practices, a reputation to protect. He could have stood there and judged them, called them out, turned their worst moments into moral lessons, but that wasn't his style. Instead, he created what the staff jokingly described as an impairment spectrum, not written down, not official, but very real. If someone was a little drunk but still charming, guide them gently. If someone was stoned but brilliant, like George Carlin, ask better questions. Let them fly. If someone was chemically supercharged but still professional, like Sammy Davis Jr., hang on and enjoy the ride. If someone was incoherent, like Truman Capote on that infamous night, or aggressive, like Oliver Reed, cut it short. Draw the line. Don't invite them back. It wasn't about judging their private lives. It was about one thing: respecting the audience. There's another huge difference between then and now. Today, if a celebrity showed up obviously high on a major show, it would be clipped, shared, slowed down, analyzed, memed, debated, and probably turned into a PR crisis within hours. There would be think pieces, hashtags, apologies, maybe rehab statements. Back then, if the host decided to treat it like a blip and move on, that's usually what happened. No social media, no viral outrage cycle. Just a weird night of television that either faded into memory or lived on only as whispered backstage stories. And if you were one of those guests who'd gone a little too far, you were often quietly grateful. More than one of them, including Richard Pryor, would later express appreciation, not for being allowed to be high, but for being protected when they were vulnerable. The guy at the desk could have exposed them. Instead, he helped them survive their own bad choices in front of millions of people. That's why so many stars trusted him. Even when they walked out barely holding it together, they knew he'd do everything in his power not to let them completely fall apart in front of the world. In the end, that's the real story behind these 7 high-as-a-kite guests. It's not just about weed, cocaine, pills, booze, or acid trips slipping onto live TV. It's about a host who understood something simple and powerful. People don't tune in to watch someone be destroyed. They tune in to be entertained and, maybe without realizing it, to see a little humanity. Even when that humanity shows up nervous, sweaty, and very, very altered. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the wild side of classic late-night TV, imagine how many more stories are hiding behind those old clips you've seen 100 times. So hey, before you go, rewatch an old interview and play Spot Who's High. Do me a favor. Hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment telling me which of these 7 guests surprised you the most. And tell me this: if you had to walk out in front of millions of people tomorrow night, would you do it stone cold sober? Or would you be tempted to take the edge off first?